Welcome back to Word Safari. This is the second episode in a series of terms that we get from ancient Greek and Roman mythology. Now, in the first episode of this series, which of course was the last episode on this channel, we started by looking at some of the terms that we get in modern English from different names of gods in Greek mythology. And the truth is that there are so many different gods that we get words from in modern English that I actually had to split just this one thing up into two episodes. In the earlier episode, we talked about gods that pertain to the earlier part, chronologically speaking, of the overall story of Greek mythology. And then in this episode, we're going to finish up by talking about gods from the later part, chronologically speaking, of Greek mythology. In future episodes, we're going to talk about terms in modern English that come from things like names of human characters, monsters, places, and religious ideas. So we will get to all of those as we keep going in this series. But we are going to pick up where we left off last time with the story of Greek mythology. Just a really brief recap, Greek mythology starts with this entity or thing called chaos, which is kind of like chaos, but not. We talked about that in the last episode. Out of chaos comes Mother Earth, who then creates Father Sky, and Mother Earth and Father Sky are the first king and queen of the cosmos. They have a bunch of children, but they especially have 12 particular children called the Titans, and we talked about some of the Titans in the last episode. But very importantly, one of the 12 Titans overthrew his father Uranos, who was Father Sky, and became the new king of the cosmos, and that particular Titan was named Kronos. In the Roman tradition, his name is Saturn, so you might call him Kronos or Saturn depending on whether you are using his Greek or Roman name. Now, Kronos was the ruler for a while, but he didn't last too long, and one of the reasons he didn't last too long as ruler is because he was something of a tyrant. He was worried that his children would overthrow him, just like he had overthrown his own father and become the king of the gods. And so as soon as his wife, Rhea, who happened to be another Titan, would have their children, as soon as they would be born, Kronos would swallow them. And so there are many images of Kronos swallowing his children. Now, it's important to note that Kronos did not chew them up. He did not kill them. These were immortal babies. So when he swallowed them, he just put them in his stomach so that they couldn't cause him any trouble, rather than just murdering them, because it was not actually possible to murder these babies. As you can imagine, this was not popular with almost anyone, especially his wife, Rhea, and so she devised a plan to basically overthrow him. Essentially what she did is she managed to sneak one of her babies, her sixth baby, Zeus, away from Kronos and keep him from being swallowed, and so Zeus was able to grow up safely on the island of Crete, and then when he grew up, he managed to trick his father into vomiting up his 5 siblings, whom he had already swallowed, and then he and his siblings, along with a bunch of other allies, waged a war against Kronos and his other Titan allies, which again, Kronos is one of the 12 Titans, so Kronos' Titan allies would have been his own brothers and sisters. This war lasted for a long time, but eventually Zeus and his siblings and his allies managed to win the war and overthrow the Titans and set up a new order called the Olympian Order, named for Mount Olympus. So Kronos, or Saturn in the Roman tradition, represents an older stage of history. It's an older empire. It's an older kingdom. And Kronos / Saturn is still alive because, again, these gods are immortal, but he is no longer able to rule the cosmos. So we get a word like Saturnine from this particular individual who played this particular part in Greek mythology. If you are Saturnine, you are gloomy, you are dark, and I think this plays into both the character of Kronos or Saturn, that he was literally eating his own kids. That's kind of dark, right? But also the fact that this is an older era that is sort of shrouded in the mists of history. He represents this period of eating your own children. Not a great time in history, right? I should also point out that the word Saturnine gets its meaning from Hellenistic astrology. This is something that we have talked about in some previous episodes here on this channel, and I'll put a link up to it. We've talked about how the ancients believed in 7 planets, and they believed that those planets had some kind of what we would today call astrological power. So if you were born under the sign of one of the 7 planets, many people believe that that would give some kind of personality to you, or impart some kind of characters or character traits to you. It was believed that if you were born under the sign of Saturn, you might be gloomy and dark. And so this word Saturnine also has some traits that come from Hellenistic astrology. Although again, I hasten to say that those traits are ultimately based on the even older layers of Greek mythology, the story that we were just talking about. Okay, so now we are moving into the Olympian phase in the chronology of Greek mythology. And the Olympian phase for the ancient Greeks was the modern era. The Olympians had not been overthrown, unlike Kronos and his Titan allies who had been overthrown. So now we are in sort of the present, at least from the perspective of 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, and really still today, because of course the story has not advanced substantively past the point when the Olympians are in charge. So again, we already just talked about Zeus. Zeus was the youngest son of Kronos. He was saved by his mother Rhea from being swallowed by his father Kronos, and therefore he was able to grow up safely and ultimately overthrow his father. His name is Zeus in the Greek tradition. His name is Jupiter in the Roman tradition, and sometimes also Jove in the Roman tradition. So you will see all of those names for this particular deity. We get this adjective jovial, which of course means cheerful or happy, which is sort of the opposite of Saturnine. And of course, given the story that I just told you, there's a pretty good reason for that. Saturn, or Kronos, is sad and gloomy, sitting in prison for his whole life, which is forever because he's immortal, whereas his son Zeus has successfully overthrown him and become the king of the cosmos and can pretty much do whatever he wants, if you know the stories from Greek mythology. Again, there's also a connection to Hellenistic astrology here, because it was believed that if you were born under the sign of the planet Jupiter, then you might also be jovial. But again, there are connections that go further back in time than Hellenistic astrology. So Zeus began building the Olympian order, and again, he did have 5 siblings whom we are going to talk about as we go forward, that sort of helped him fill out the pantheon of Olympian gods. But he also started having children who then also became important gods and helped to fill out the Olympian family. One of those children was the god Ares, who was the god of war. He was named Mars in the Roman tradition, and so we get some words that have to do with warfare from the name of this god, such as martial. If there's something martial, it has to do with warfare or fighting, like the martial arts or something like that. Those come from the Roman name of this god, who was Mars. Of course, again, there is a planet named after this particular god, and we are actually just taking these gods in order of planets from furthest to closest to the sun before we get to some of the gods who don't have planets named after them, or certainly didn't in the ancient world. So we also get a word, of course, like Martian from the name of this god Mars, but that comes through the planet, of course. We call individuals Martians, these hypothetical alien creatures who come from the planet Mars. The planet Mars was named after the god of war because it looked red to them, and of course we know why it looks red today. It's not blood, but they thought, hey, it looks like a bloody planet, so we are going to name it after our god of war. So there are several steps to get from Ares or Mars to Martian, but there you go. Again, skipping Earth now and going to the next planet closest to the sun, who is also a goddess. This is the goddess Aphrodite. Now, there are 2 different major versions of her birth story. According to one version, Aphrodite actually predates Zeus and predates the Olympian order entirely, and then was later sort of adopted into it. According to another version, Aphrodite is just another child of Zeus. So that's why I'm sort of putting her here in the children of Zeus section. However, ultimately, it doesn't really matter because she does get adopted into the Olympian order, whether she gets born into it or comes into it another way. Her Roman name was Venus, and so of course we get the planet Venus from this because it looks bright and warm. Aphrodite/Venus was the goddess of love and lust and sex and desire. She was the goddess of all of these things, so it's not surprising that we get a word like venereal that basically just is an adjective that means having to do with love or sex in some way, generally speaking. In case you're wondering why this word looks a little bit different from Venus, if you if you decline out her name in the Latin language, and again, I won't get into too much detail here, but if you wanted to say there were multiple Venuses, you would say Veneres, at least in a modern English translation. So that ER is actually part of her name in other forms of her name. Let's go on to the planet closest to the sun, who also happens to be a child of Zeus, and that is Hermes / Mercury in the Roman tradition. So we actually get words from both the Greek name of this god Hermes and the Roman name of this god Mercury. This god was the god of many things. Communication and travel were two of the biggest things that he was the god of. So it's not surprising that we get a lot of words that have something to do with communication or travel or movement from the name of this particular god. We get hermeneutic, which is probably not a word you use on an everyday basis, but this comes from an ancient Greek root that is connected to the name Hermes, that means to interpret or to help someone understand something. And this fits Hermes really well because, again, he is the god of communication and he is the god of facilitating communication between two or more people. A hermeneutic is a way of understanding something, and so that's what that word means. We also get the word hermetic from the name Hermes. We have a phrase, hermetically sealed, which means something is sealed in an airtight fashion. This actually goes back to Hermes because in the ancient Hellenistic and Roman period, it was believed that Hermes was the one who had invented vacuum sealing. Of course, most people in the ancient world believed that most inventions of any kind came from one god or another, so it wouldn't have been particularly weird to credit a particular god with a particular invention. It just so happened that they thought that Hermes was the one who had invented hermetic sealing, and so they named it Hermetic after him, after his Greek name, Hermes. What about some things that we get from the Roman name, Mercury? Of course, we get the planet Mercury, and we also get the element Mercury, which has been called quicksilver, and so it's connected to this idea of quickness and motion, and goes back to the idea of who this god was. Similarly connected to the idea that Mercury is always moving back and forth. He is a god always on the go. He's always traveling to take messages places and to lead people places and to help guide people places. So we get this word mercurial from the name of Mercury, but also perhaps from the planet Mercury. If something is mercurial, it is always changing. Hermes / Mercury is always changing his place. He's always moving all over the place. You're never really sure where he is going to be. He is very active. So if something is mercurial, it is very active. It's just always in motion. It's always changing. You can't necessarily depend on it to be in any one place or any one state. Okay, let's move on and talk about the brothers and sisters of Zeus. I mentioned that he had 5 brothers and sisters, all of whom had been swallowed by their father Kronos before being vomited up later. His 2 brothers were Neptune or Poseidon and Hades, as we are going to talk about here. Poseidon is the Greek name of his brother, one of his brothers here. And again, the Roman name is Neptune. And of course, we get the name of the planet Neptune from this particular god. Neptune was actually discovered later. Neptune was not one of the original classical planets. Of course, you may have noticed we skipped a planet between Saturn and Neptune, and of course that is because we talked about it in the last episode. That was Uranus, named after these guys' grandfather, Father Sky, who was Uranos or Uranus. So Neptune was only discovered a little under 200 years ago with the aid of telescopes, which were growing increasingly powerful and still are. And it was named Neptune partially because we hadn't used that god yet, but partially because it's blue. It looks like a water world, even though we know that that's not water that's making it blue. And so it was a natural choice to name it after this other Olympian god, Poseidon, or again, in the Roman tradition, Neptune. And there are adjectives that have something to do with this particular god, but they're not really very common. There's also an element named Neptunium that is also not very well known or very common, but it is there. And then Zeus and Poseidon's other brother is Hades. And in the Roman tradition, his name is Pluto, which actually, interestingly, just comes from a Greek epithet for Hades, because Pluto means wealthy. So one of the the terms that would be used for the god Hades was the wealthy one. Who is the god Hades? Why is he important? He is the god of the underworld. So Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades split up the entire cosmos between them. Zeus got the sky and the air, and then Poseidon got the sea, and to some extent the land as well. And then Hades literally drew the short end of the straw and got the underworld. Again, they believed, at least in early Greek mythology, in this tripartite division of the cosmos. Remember, in a flat earth, you have sky, land, and water, and then the underworld down here. So Hades gets the underworld. Hades/Pluto is the god of the underworld. He is the god of the dead, but unlike perhaps in many modern traditions at least, he's not evil. He is not against the order that is being led by his brother Zeus. He is a willing participant and ally in this order and a friend of his brothers. He has not rebelled against them, unlike maybe some Disney movies might make you believe. So of course, the planet, or should I say ex-planet or disputed planet, Pluto, is named after this brother. I guess, again, they figured this would be a god that would be a good one to use for the name of this far outlying celestial body, whether we call it a planet or not. Of course, the element plutonium also goes here and is also named after this particular god. And finally, as you can see on your screen here, we get another pretty popular character in popular culture from this particular god. Now, you might be wondering what the connection is or ever was between a gloomy, dark god of the dead and god of the underworld and this sort of happy dog that is a Disney character. From what I understand, the dog was named shortly after the planet was named and discovered in 1930. So it may well be that Disney or some of his associates just decided to jump on the popularity of this newly discovered celestial body and name this dog after it. So the planet is named after the god, but the dog may actually be named after the planet, which at least makes more sense than him being named after the god. Now again, these three brothers who split up the cosmos between them did have three sisters. There were 6 of them in total, and so here are the 3 sisters, and we do get words from the names of these 3 sisters as well. One of their sisters was named Demeter. In the Roman tradition, she was named Ceres, would have been a hard C originally, Ceres in Latin, and we get words like cereal from this particular goddess's name. Why do we get a word like this from this particular goddess? Because she was the goddess of agriculture. She was the goddess of growing crops and tending crops and loving Mother Earth in a way that you will get something out of her. That's essentially what Demeter or Ceres represents. So originally, cereal was just a general adjective that had something to do with crops that are being grown out of the earth. And in the Western world, which is to say Europe, Middle East, North Africa, the primary crops that were grown out of the earth were all grains of some kind, or almost all grains of some kind. And so cereal came to be an adjective that just meant having to do with grain. And then in many contexts, especially today, it got narrowed down even further to some particular kind of grain-based thing that might come in a box and that you might eat for breakfast, although we still talk about hot cereals as well. I don't usually include words that aren't English on here, unless, of course, we use them enough in English that you might be aware of them. Here's a Spanish word that we use a fair amount. Certainly here in the United States we do, living next to hundreds of millions of Spanish speakers to our south and many here in the United States. We come across this word a lot, this Spanish word cerveza, which, of course, just means beer in Spanish, but it comes from the name of the goddess Ceres because, of course, as I probably don't need to tell you, beer is made from grains, and she is the goddess of grains. So this is another cool connection. Her sister, and again, the sister of all of these gods we have just been talking about, is Hestia. In the Roman tradition, this goddess's name was Vesta. Originally, that would have been pronounced Westa. We get a few things from this. Nothing quite as big as cereal, maybe, that's used on a daily basis. But there has been a asteroid in the asteroid belt named after her. As it turns out, there's also been an asteroid belt named after her sister, Ceres. So you can see Ceres and Vesta and pictures of both of them there and how big they are compared to each other. There are also some other things in pop culture that have something to do with Vesta. characters in movies and things like that. The adjective of Vesta is Vestal. If you've ever read anything about Roman religion, you may have heard of the Vestal Virgins, who are an endless source of fascination to this day. The Vestal Virgins were the priestesses of the goddess Vesta, who lived at Rome and tended her sacred eternal fire. Hestia and Vesta, again, that's the same goddess, but Hestia / Vesta didn't really do much in the mythology. She doesn't take part in really almost any stories, and the reason is that she is the goddess of the fireplace. She is the goddess of the hearth. She sits there at home. She is the goddess of home life. This would have been really important for most of our ancestors from anywhere in the world because, of course, they didn't have central heat or electricity. So in the cold months, the family would spend a lot of time around the fireplace, and it was the gathering place for family moments and family memories. And essentially, Hestia is the goddess of all of those things. Finally, the last of these 6 siblings and the last sister to talk about is Hera. Hera's Roman name was Juno. Hera is very important because she ended up marrying her brother Zeus, ultimately because he pursued her, and so she became the queen of the gods and the queen of the cosmos. We have talked in a previous episode about how she is the goddess of marriage, partially, of course, because she is the queen of the king of the universe, so it kind of makes sense that she would be the goddess of marriage. The month June is named after her, and I'll put a link to a month's episode that I did a while back up here if you want to check out more about why the month June is named after her. But I mean, the quick answer is that this was the month that most weddings have historically happened, and since she is the goddess of marriage and weddings, the whole month got named after her. Pretty cool, huh? Let's talk about some of the other children that Zeus had to ultimately fill out the 14 Olympian gods and goddesses. He had a daughter named Athena. In the Roman tradition, her name is Minerva. And I probably don't need to tell you that we get the name of the very famous city of Athens, which is today the capital of Greece, from the name of this goddess. And this is not an accident. This is not an incidental connection. The name Athens is actually directly tied to the name of the goddess Athena. Specifically, it was named after her. In the original Greek, it's just the plural of her name, Athenae, and that's why in English we put an S at the end of Athen, because we're trying to literally translate it and make it plural, even though it doesn't necessarily make sense to us why this would be plural. This is oftentimes how they named cities after gods or goddesses in ancient Greece. They would just use the plural of the name of the particular deity, and that's exactly what they did. So Athens was one of the major cities of ancient Greece, and of course it is the capital of the nation of Greece, the modern country of Greece today. And Athena was its patron goddess. Now, that doesn't mean they still weren't polytheistic. They still worshiped all of these gods that we are talking about, but for them, they focused a lot of their special worship on the goddess Athena, and they had a lot of stories about her. Athena was the goddess of strategy, of civilization, of many inventions, although she shared that distinction with her brother Hermes and other gods as well. So she was certainly a very important individual. Another very important individual was her brother, another child of Zeus, and his name was Hephaestus. In the Roman tradition, Hephaestus was named Vulcan, and we get more words from Vulcan than we do from Hephaestus. Hephaestus was the god of creative fire, so he would oftentimes be found in his workshop, creating swords, using fire to weld things together, or to craft some kind of metal objects or other creative items that you would need a very hot fire to essentially create, both in the ancient world and today. So he was essentially a blacksmith god, and it's not surprising that in the ancient world they connected him to volcanoes, because volcanoes are, of course, sources of very hot fire that belches out of these mountains. The Mediterranean, both then and now, is a very volcanically active region of the world, and so people in ancient Greece and Italy and that entire region were very familiar with volcanoes and what they looked like, and potentially their devastating effects. people in the ancient world connected volcanoes to this particular god, so much so that they named them after him, at least his Roman name. So we get volcano from the Roman name of this god, which was Vulcan. Of course, we also get species in Star Trek from this particular name as well. But as I probably don't need to tell you, that was a later development. Another child of Zeus, and we are getting close to the end of the Olympic pantheon here, but another child of Zeus was Dionysus. His Roman name was Bacchus. Dionysus was a very complex figure, and we certainly don't have time to do him justice here, but he was, among other things, the god of partying. He was the god of drinking. He was the god of alcohol and altered substances and things like that, but especially he was the god of wine. He is oftentimes pictured with grapes. You can see grapes on this statue of Dionysus here on your screen. And so it's not surprising that we get a word like bacchanal from the Roman name Bacchus. A bacchanal is just a big party. It's a cool name that you can throw around if you want to sound like your party is sort of fancy. Instead of saying you're going to a party, you can tell your friends that you are going to a bacchanal. And finally, the last two Olympian gods, just to round out all 14 that we are talking about here, are Apollo and Artemis. And Apollo and Artemis are also children of Zeus. In fact, they are twins. Apollo and Artemis are twin brother and twin sister. At least in most traditions, they are twins. In some traditions, they are just regular brother and sister. But regardless, they are very close. Artemis's Roman name is Diana, and Apollo is the only god who actually doesn't have a special Roman name. His name is Apollo in both the Greek and the Roman tradition. Interestingly, even though these are very important gods, and Apollo is honestly one of probably the three most talked about and most important gods of these 14 in the Olympian pantheon, we don't get a lot of words from either Apollo or Artemis or Diana. Obviously, we get the name Diana from this goddess. So the woman's name that we have today, Diana, does just come from this particular goddess. But other than that, we don't seem to get a lot of words from these two gods. So if you have any words that you think are worth talking about here, feel free to comment in the comment section. Now, that covers the Olympian gods, the Olympian pantheon. But before we leave this particular topic of words in English that we get from names of Greek gods, let's talk about a few other gods that were active during the Olympian period that were part of the natural order as believed by the Greeks. One of them is Pan. It's a very simple name, as you can see, and Pan was not one of the Olympian gods. He was a somewhat lesser god, but still very important, still talked about. He lived out in the countryside. He was one of these nature deities, and the Greeks and Romans believed in a large class of nature deities that inhabited the woods and the fields and the mountains and the streams and the rivers and those kind of places. Pan is oftentimes pictured as being part human, part goat, and the parts of him that are human and goat might differ depending on the statue or description of him. But Pan would oftentimes hang out in the woods and then jump out at you and surprise you, and this is actually where we get the word panic from, because if Pan jumps out of the woods or from behind a tree when you're on a nature hike one day and starts running at you with his goat face, you might panic and you might run too, and that is where we originally get the word and concept of panic from. We also get pan pipes. Sometimes these are called pan flute, pan pipes, pan something. They come from Pan because one of the things that Pan would do when he was out there alone in nature is he would play some kind of musical instrument that was involving pipes. You can see him doing that there in the picture, and so that actually comes from the name of Pan. Let's talk about two brothers who, again, are not part of the Olympian gods, but were certainly part of the cosmic order as the Greeks believed in it. One of them is Hypnos. Hypnos is the god of sleep, and so we get a number of words that have something to do with a sleep-like state from the name of this particular god. One of them is hypnosis, which of course is not literally falling asleep, but it is a state that is sort of a dream-like state, and so it's not surprising that we get hypnosis from the name of this god. And of course, the adjective is hypnotic. If something is hypnotic, it might not literally put you to sleep, but it puts you into some kind of state that is like sleep. And again, this comes from the name of the god of sleep in Greek mythology, which was Hypnos. Hypnos had a brother, and that brother was Thanatos, and Thanatos was the god of death. So it's interesting that sleep and death were considered to be brothers in Greek mythology, which, if you think about it, kind of makes sense. So we get words, anything that has Thana or Thanat in it comes from this ancient Greek word and root that means death. So thanatology is the technical study of death. Also, the bad guy in a certain recent movie franchise was named Thanos. That ultimately harkens back to this idea of death, so it is a fitting name. Finally, Hypnos had a son, and that was Morpheus. Morpheus was the god of dreams. It makes sense that the god of dreams would be the son of the god of sleep, because of course those two things go hand in hand. Morpheus's name actually is connected to our word morph, which I didn't even put on here, but the verb morph means to change your shape, and we get that from this ancient Greek root, because Morpheus, as the god of dreams, is the god of shapes. He flits into your head, and he puts shapes and visions of things in there, and then he leaves, and they were never real. That's essentially what a dream is, and so his name is ultimately connected both to dreams and to shapes and to change. And we get the name of a particular drug, morphine, from this particular god, the god of dreams, because of course this is a pain-killing medication that oftentimes makes people sleepy and maybe even have weird dreams. Full disclosure, I've never taken morphine myself, so I am hearing this from other people, but this is one of the reasons that this particular drug was named morphine. Of course, again, as you probably know from this picture, we get characters like Morpheus in a particular movie franchise from the name of this particular god in Greek mythology too. And it's always interesting to try to figure out why the creators of these franchises and these fantasy worlds chose these names from Greek mythology. Usually they're trying to tell you something when they choose these names. Okay, those are all the names of major gods that contribute some kind of word into English and our vocabulary today. As you can see, when you learn about Greek mythology, you learn more about our language as well. Stay tuned for part 3, and we are going to dig further into Greek mythology and learn what other words in English we get from it. See you then.